Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take those really complex systems, those dense historical documents, stacks of research, and we try to boil them down into the essential knowledge you really need to be well informed.
Uh-huh.
And today, we're really undertaking, I think, a meticulous deep dive. We're going right into the foundations of modern military thought.
Yeah, that's right. We're stepping back, way back to 19th century Prussia and then Germany. Our mission today, really, is to understand that organizational engine, the general staff. How did they build this military machine that was so successful? It just fundamentally redefined how modern industrial powers wage war. Its influence, is stretched across the globe for over a century.
Wow.
And our sources today, they're definitely expert analyses. They detail the revolution in military affairs, the creation of the mass army, and those really rigorous training methods inside the Kriegsakademie. That's the German General Staff School.
Okay, so the sources are dense, but they give us this incredible insight, don't they? We're talking about how a collection of frankly fragmented states somehow built a fighting doctrine that delivered these just stunning rapid victories back in the 1860s and 70s. But here's the central thing, the fascinating paradox we really want to explore for you today. How did this system get so incredibly successful, tactically and operationally? They were the undisputed masters of the battlefield, only to then struggle so profoundly with executing grand strategy later on in the 20th century.
That paradox is absolutely key. We're going to try and extract the specific methods, the technologies, and the philosophical underpinnings that really molded this unique Prussian way of war. We're tracing that exact path, from operational genius to strategic short-sightedness.
Okay, let's unpack this blueprint then, because the whole German military revolution, it wasn't driven by ambition initially, was it? It was driven by just abject failure.
That's exactly right.
We have to start with that devastating Napoleonic defeat of Prussia at Jena Auerstadt in 1806. That just completely invalidated their old way of doing things.
Yeah, Jena was a huge institutional shock. It wasn't just a battlefield loss. It made it crystal clear that those rigid, aristocratic, limited mercenary armies of the old regime just couldn't compete. Not against Napoleon's dynamic, motivated citizen armies.
Right.
So reformers like Gerhard Scharnhorst, August von Gneisenau, and of course the famous Karl von Clausewitz, they realized national survival meant total systemic renewal. They had to emulate the power of the French Revolution's concept of total war, even while they were fighting against France itself.
Interesting point. And the cornerstone of that profound transformation, you mentioned Lewis's analysis details this, was the military law of 1814. Hermann von Boyen drafted it. And this single piece of legislation, it seems, completely changed the relationship between the Prussian citizen and the state, really by changing who served in the army.
Absolutely. It brought in the concept of universal male military service based on conscription, drafting men from all social classes. Now, that seems pretty straightforward to us today, maybe.
Yeah.
But Lewis really emphasizes how unique this was in 19th century Europe. Sure, most nations used conscription, but it was almost always limited to the lower classes, right? Or the wealthy. They could just buy substitutes or pay their way out of service. Prussia systematically put an end to that substitution system.
Okay, so no buying your way out. And the service structure itself sounds incredibly demanding. It created this huge trained reserve pool. Men served, 3 years in the regular army?
Initially 3, then later reduced to 2 after 1834. But then that was followed by 2 years in reserve status and then service in the citizen militia, the Landwehr.
Ah, the Landwehr. So that component, it sounds crucial. It sort of symbolized that citizen soldier ideal.
Exactly. It meant that basically every segment of society was now personally invested in the defense of the state. And that ensured the mass army was, literate, numerate, and drawn from the best of the entire social fabric, not just the poor or disenfranchised.
And Lewis points out this really staggering irony, doesn't he? That the very development of universal male military service, drawing on everyone regardless of status, was arguably the most democratic institution in Prussia at the time.
Yeah.
In a state that was, let's be honest, politically and structurally lagging way behind its Western neighbors in other democratic areas. So this compulsory service, designed to build state power, was somehow also the ultimate equalizer.
Precisely. So, now you have this massive nationalized force, but an army of potentially 1 million men drawn from all these different territories, using complex new technology. Well, it can't be commanded effectively by just a single royal general who happened to be born into the right family.
Right, makes sense.
You need a specialized institution to organize it, to direct it. And this is where the general staff, as detailed by Lewis and also Newland, was really institutionalized as the nation's brain.
Okay, so this structure starts taking shape, and we see the rise of Helmuth von Moltke. We should probably call him Moltke the Elder to avoid confusion later.
Good point, yes. Moltke the Elder.
He enters the general staff in 1832, and Lewis notes his intellectual foundation was forged pretty early. His experience included, what, 4 years as a military advisor to the Ottoman Empire?
That's right. Which apparently revealed him as a really keen observer, very high intellect. He was the one who really codified how this national military brain would function.
And the function of these general staff officers, it wasn't just admin work, was it? It was to ensure competence existed right at the highest operational level.
Absolutely. Their primary role, really, was to support commanders who might lack that extensive military training or, frankly, strategic capacity. Newland provides this fascinating and maybe a bit cutting analysis that defined why the general staff was so necessary. He says general staff officers support incompetent generals, providing the talents that might otherwise be wanting among leaders and commanders.
Wow, okay, so it's like an institutional guarantee of operational effectiveness,
Yeah,
designed to overcome the limitations of a system that was still kind of reliant on birthright for ultimate command.
exactly.
They weren't just assistants, they were the essential intelligence layer. They ensured decisions were coordinated, timely, and, operationally sound, even if the general nominally commanding them wasn't quite up to scratch himself.
That's the idea. They were the engine ensuring the machine worked, regardless of who was holding the steering wheel, so to speak.
Okay, so if the general staff was the brain,
Hmm.
then the Kriegsakademie, the War Academy, was the factory floor where that brain was molded, refined. This wasn't some gentleman's finishing school, was it?
Oh, definitely not. It was an intense filter designed specifically to produce a certain type of operational expert. And we get this unique, really close-up view of the training process, thanks to Captain Harlan and Hartness's 1936 report on the German General Staff School.
Right, Hartness's report. And what immediately jumps out from that report is the conviction that, only younger, more active officers should be shaping the next war.
Yeah, they were quite firm on that.
The selection process was highly competitive, ensuring the students were really in their prime. Hartness noted the ages in his group, they ranged from 29 to 37, average age 33, mostly captains. They were clearly looking for officers already tagged as future leaders.
And the whole educational environment, it was designed for intense personal instruction. Hartness emphasizes the use of these small groups, called Horsal, ideally like 15 to 23 students.
That's small.
Yeah, he explicitly says classes of 25 were considered too many. This fostered a really intimate, high-stakes discussion environment. Nowhere for a student to hide, really.
You can imagine, and the staffing reflected that intensity.
It did. The instructional staff included high-ranking general staff officers, the Lehrer under Kriegsakademie, but also specialized branched experts. But the tactical instructor, that person was the linchpin. Always a general staff member, chosen not just for rank, but specifically for their teaching ability, their sound judgment, and crucially, their proven troop-leading ability out in the field.
Practical experience mattered.
Immensely.
Yeah.
Now, looking at the curriculum itself, the priorities are just undeniable. The daily schedule was demanding, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., longer during maneuvers, obviously.
Okay.
In the first year, Hartness lists heavy emphasis on tactics, multiple hours every day, military history, and supply. Then the second year layered on all those specialized technical elements needed for modern war. Signal communication, aviation, mechanization, engineering, transportation. It was clearly a curriculum designed to create technical masters of the operational art.
But it wasn't all just theory and tech, right? They had to ground it in history and practice.
Absolutely. Each student had to present one lecture over the whole 2-year course. And this was a proper deep dive into historical operations. For the Wars of Unification, Frederick the Great, or the World War, Hartness specifies this research assignment was always closely linked to whatever the military history lecturer was teaching at that moment. So history was made immediately applicable to current doctrine.
Making history relevant, not just academic.
Precisely. And here's where I think the real philosophical brilliance of the general staff training emerges. The instructional method itself was centered on living the problem.
Living the problem. What does that mean exactly?
Well, all tactical instruction was delivered through these demanding troop-leading problems. The core concept, Hartness details this really well, required the student not just to arrive at a conclusion, like on paper, but to literally live and feel the situation. It had to be, in Hartness's words, a life and blood proposition, not some detached contemplative solution. So when solving a problem, the student had to visualize themselves right there on the ground, issuing orders personally or through staff officers, maybe to artillery or leading regiments. This whole process emphasized the critical time factor, the pressure, the necessity for decisive action. It made the solution a practical exercise in command execution under stress.
Wow, so it's about internalizing the pressure, not just finding the answer.
Exactly. And crucially, the institution actively refused to teach a single, rigid, correct answer. Hartness noted that in the discussions after a problem, no single approved solution was ever offered. Why? Because, as they saw it, every problem will have several satisfactory or workable solutions.
Hmm.
They would only heavily criticize obviously unsound solutions. The instructor would offer his solution with his reasoning, but he never announced some arbitrary best one.
That's a staggering commitment to fostering independent thought and initiative, especially within a military structure. They were training flexibility, not just replication.
Exactly. And this flexibility, it was reinforced by the instructor's own autonomy. Hartness describes them as basically monarchs of their small domain. They only got a broad outline of training objectives. They were responsible for writing their own problems, coming up with their own solutions. This fostered the core thesis that no single set solution applies to two different problems. It constantly pushed the boundaries of tactical thinking.
Okay, so this brings us to the ultimate aim then. It wasn't just about technical proficiency, was it? It was about character.
That's the heart of it. Hartness quotes a paragraph directly from the official text, Truppenführung, that's the field service regulations, which states explicitly, war is the severest test of spiritual and bodily strength. In war, character outweighs intellect.
Character outweighs intellect. That really sums it up.
It absolutely reveals the core of the system. The primary objectives were character, will, decision, and initiative. Officers were trained not to wait for clearer information, not to wait for perfect orders. Vacillation, half measures, those were heavily castigated, even if the resulting decision wasn't technically perfect. Hartness concludes that, in their view, omissions and neglects incriminated a commander far more severely than mistakes in the choice of means.
So the cultural message is crystal clear. Action, even imperfect action, is way better than hesitation.
Yes.
And this intense training environment, it culminated in maneuvers, I assume.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Starting with one-sided map maneuvers. They called them Planübungen in the first year. That allowed the instructor to control the play, stress specific principles, and really focus on the rapidity of decision-making.
Okay, one-sided first.
And then, the ultimate test. The two-sided map maneuver, or Kriegspiel, starting in the second year. The class gets split into opposing blue and red sides. Now it's about genuine free play, command roles, staff work, and the timely issuance of orders using simulated wartime communication short messages, that kind of thing. This entire system, from start to finish, was designed to produce aggressive, decisive leaders who trusted their training and could act decisively under immense pressure.
Right, so we have the foundation, that mass citizen army, and we have the factory, the Creeks Academy, producing these aggressive, highly skilled operational technicians. Now, what tools did Moltke the Elder give them to actually fight this new kind of industrial? Radical changes in operational methods.
Moltke really did crack the code on integrating these new industrial technologies into warfare. The two biggest operational game changers were, without a doubt, the railroad and the needle gun. Moltke, as chief of staff, realized that if you could properly organize the deployment, railroads offered strategic speed that was just unprecedented in history.
But it's important to remember, this wasn't universally accepted right away, was it? Lewis notes that even some reformers, like Hermann von Boyen, feared railroads would lead to, quote, dangerously rigid and mechanical mobilization plans.
That's true. There was concern they'd make the Army too dependent on fixed infrastructure, too predictable.
Yeah.
But Moltke saw past those logistical limits. He understood that using railroads effectively required a level of detailed, meticulous general staff planning that simply didn't exist anywhere else at the time. Those large-scale transport systems developed after 1850 were absolutely crucial because they allowed Prussia to mobilize and concentrate forces much faster than any potential enemy.
Speed and planning. Okay, what about the second technological shift? The Drace needle gun, adopted back in the 1840s, right?
Yep. And this breech-loading rifle gave the Prussian infantry a massive firepower advantage, especially in the 1866 war against Austria, whose soldiers were still using muzzle loaders.
And the tactical advantages must have been huge. Lewis and Showalter detail this, I think.
Oh, profound. The Prussian soldier could reload and fire while lying down. That offered both protection and a significantly higher rate of fire than traditional muskets. It fundamentally changed how infantry combat worked. Now, Showalter does point out the limitations, mind you.
Okay.
The effective range was relatively short, maybe 700 paces max, and there was internal resistance to adopting it fully, concerns about the, quote, extraordinary demands it placed on fire discipline. Basically, fear of soldiers just blazing away and using too much ammunition.
The classic logistics concern. But despite those debates, Moltke used these tech leaps to completely redefine operational art. He had to solve the challenge of commanding these massive, corps-sized units moving on very limited road network.
It did. And his solution was radical. He decided to violate the long-standing Napoleonic tenet of massing all your troops before the battle.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive.
It was. But that's the essence of Moltke's operational innovation. Instead of concentrating beforehand, which created these huge logistical jams on terrible roads, he planned for the external concentration of forces, meaning the separate armies would converge directly on the battlefield during the engagement itself.
How did that work in practice?
Railroads deployed the separate armies to widely spaced railheads, and then those separate forces would converge like hammers hitting an anvil right on the enemy position, coordinated by the general staff, of course.
Okay, the ultimate test for this counterintuitive system must have been the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866 against the Austrians.
That was it. The Austrian commander, Ludwig August von Benedek, theoretically held the advantage of interior lines. That means he should have been able to strike the separated Prussian armies one by one before they could link up.
But he couldn't.
Nope. Moltke's planning, the timing, and the convergence of the First Army and Crown Prince Frederick William's Second Army achieved this devastating double envelopment against the Austrian position. And the needle gun's higher rate of fire proved absolutely devastating in the close quarters fighting that resulted, especially in key terrain like the Sweep Forest. The sheer volume of Prussian fire just broke the Austrian attacks.
And this victory, it wasn't just sealed by Prussian excellence, was it? Austrian staff work played a part too, negatively.
A huge part. Lewis notes that faulty Austrian staff work basically betrayed their own army during the crucial retreat. Troop units didn't receive specific, coordinated march routes. It led to total anarchy at the Elbe River crossing sites, chaos, and that sealed the decisive victory for Prussia, a failure of their brain.
Wow. Okay, so that stunning 1866 victory must have confirmed the general staff's belief in its system. And just 4 years later, they applied it again, maybe even more effectively, against France in the Franco-Prussian War. Warrow gives us this excellent, almost damning comparison between the two systems, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Warrow's analysis is brutal on the French system. The contrast in manpower and quality is just stark. The French relied on a smaller, professional force based on long service, 7 years or more.
Which sounds good on paper, maybe.
You'd think. But that system led to an older, much less dynamic officer corps. Warrow cites the average captain age as 45, lieutenants 37. Often physically unfit and intellectually, quote, apathetic and inert from years of stagnant garrison duty and just a lack of educational renewal.
Compared to the Prussians.
Compared to the Prussians, who leveraged their universal conscription system to mobilize over 1 million men, France could only manage about 400,000. The Prussians maintained a younger, more aggressive officer corps. Constantly under Moltke and the general staff scrutiny, they were quick to sack underperformers, by the way.
Ruthless efficiency.
And furthermore, those Prussian conscripts were highly literate, highly numerate, reflecting the high educational standards built into their whole system from the start.
And the immediate logistical superiority, that was undeniable too.
Overwhelming. Warrow details Prussia's mobilization speed, 3 to 7 days to assemble a corps, made possible by years of detailed general staff planning, constant practice, and a superior railway network with double-track strategic lines built specifically for military mass movements, suitable platforms, the works.
And the French?
The French logistical system was just completely unprepared. They needed 3 weeks to assemble an army corps. Their strategic railways were inadequate, and critically, they had a complete lack of war plans. Warrow reports this unbelievable failure. At the climax of the July crisis in 1870, General Edmond Leboeuf, the French war minister, actually admitted to the emperor that he had no plan of campaign. None at all.
No plan. That's incredible at the moment of crisis.
Incredible, but true. They just lacked the institutional planning capacity, the brain, to match the Prussians.
Okay, now let's revisit the weaponry, though, because in 1870, the technological advantage actually shifted, didn't it? The French had the better rifle.
That's right, a crucial point. The French possessed the superior rifle. the
Yeah.
Chassepots. It was rushed into service after their wake-up call in 1866, and it definitely outclassed the aging Prussian needle gun
How much better was it?
significantly. Warroad details the Chassepots' effective range was about 1,000 yards, compared to the needle gun's maybe 400 yards, max effective range. And its smaller, more finely milled round inflicted far more damaging wounds. So the French had the superior hardware. But here's the great paradox. They still lost, decisively.
And the reason lies where...
That's how our
where
command culture, entirely in doctrine and command culture. The French relied on fixed defensive positions, set-piece battles, trying to maximize the range advantage of their superior rifle. But the Prussians embraced what Warrow calls a rougher approach. They used creeping Prussian tactics and the principle of successive efforts.
Okay, unpack that. Creeping tactics, successive efforts.
It means they didn't wait for a perfect, coordinated plan from on high. They deployed small columns, often just skirmishers, Jaegers, to probe the French lines. Then they would rapidly reinforce any point of success spontaneously, feeding troops in to roll up the flanks.
So constant pressure, find a weak spot, exploit it immediately.
Exactly. They were constantly fighting at close range, which confused the French commanders, who couldn't tell if they were facing just a reconnaissance in force or the main battle. This decentralized initiative, the very thing trained so hard at the Kriegsacademy, it basically overcame the French technological advantage in rifle range.
That initiative again. And this contrast extended to other areas like reconnaissance.
Absolutely.
Right.
Prussian cavalry had reformed significantly after 1866. They emphasized reconnaissance, map reading, function over just parade ground form. They adopted the motto, better to be everywhere with one's cavalry than stuck in big masses. They were the eyes and ears of those converging armies.
While the French cavalry.
Warrow calls them a tragically wasted asset, often just massed behind the lines, poorly trained for actual scouting. This left the French commanders fighting essentially blind, often unaware of the converging Prussian armies bearing down on them, unable to anticipate Moltke's external concentration strategy.
Blindness on the battlefield, amplified by strategic paralysis at the top.
Precisely. Look at the Battle of Mars-la-Tour. Marshal Achille Bazaine exhibited what Warrow calls strategic diffidence. He failed to capitalize on tactical victories, he yielded the critical road to Verdun, and retreated into the fortress of Metz. Warrow emphasizes the road to Verdun, the escape route to the northwest. It was wide open. But Bazaine retreated anyway, apparently fearing exposure or maybe just lacking initiative.
And this command failure, it was compounded by politics back in Paris.
Terribly so. Empress Eugénie, terrified of a revolution breaking out if the army retreated toward the capital, compelled Marshal Patrice MacMahon to march the army of Chalon east towards Metz to try and link up with Bazaine instead of retreating to the safety of Paris's fortifications.
A purely political decision overriding military sense.
Completely. And this disastrous political interference led directly to the ultimate envelopment, the classic Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle at Sedan. The entire French field army and Emperor Napoleon III himself were captured. Game over.
So these wars of unification, 64 against Denmark, 66 against Austria, 70 against France, they absolutely confirm the Prussian system as the pinnacle of operational excellence.
Yeah.
Lewis points out these victories cemented that Napoleonic legacy, the cult of the offensive, right? Waged with the greatest possible force, aiming for rapid, decisive destruction of the enemy army.
Yeah, this commitment to overwhelming offensive action, it became known within the German officer corps itself as Angriffshetz. It basically translates to attack mania or attack obsession. It wasn't just a tactic. It became this deeply ingrained cultural mindset that viewed any hesitation, any political constraint as inherent weakness.
And this cultural obsession, it led directly to that critical intellectual trap that Newland identifies so clearly. The general staff started confusing tactical and operational success as being synonymous with strategy itself. Winning the battle decisively became the strategy. Full stop.
Exactly. And this internal, almost purely tactical focus meant they actively started dismissing Karl von Clausewitz, arguably the greatest strategic thinker Germany ever produced. Newland explains that Clausewitz was viewed as, quote, more of a philosopher, a theoretician of war rather than a practitioner, not relevant to the practical business of commanding corps and writing railroad movement orders.
So they sidelined the philosophy of war for the mechanics of war?
Pretty much. Moltke the Younger, for instance, famously advised his own son to read Alfred von Schlieffen's essays on the decisive envelopment battle at Cannae instead of Clausewitz's profound exploration of war as fundamentally an extension of political policy. They wanted decisive battle plans, not complex political military theory.
And we can trace the roots of this strategic deficit right back to the educational foundation, can't we? If you look at the General Staff School curriculum, the Kriegsacademy, after 1871 and right through to 1903, the dominance of tactics is just absolute.
It is, and crucially, the subjects that provide the necessary context for grand strategy, for understanding the bigger picture, they were systematically removed or marginalized. Newland highlights this clearly. Subjects like philosophy, literature, general history, the things that give leaders that broader context of state affairs, human nature, political maneuvering, they were conspicuously absent or removed entirely by 1903. The focus became ever more narrowly technical, reinforcing the ideal of the operational technician over the holistic statesman or strategic thinker.
The result sounds like an officer corps of truly exceptional technical competence, but with little exposure to the higher levels of strategy, as Newland puts it. A dangerous imbalance of perspective. Masters of means, perhaps, but poor judges of ends.
Well said. And this deficit inevitably translated into a kind of political arrogance, didn't it? Newland describes how the General Staff began viewing themselves as the ultimate experts, not just in military matters, but in state security policy overall. They saw the battlefield as the only true measure of national success.
So they started pushing back against civilian control.
Exactly. They chafed against and intrigued against civilian control after the 1860s and successfully became dominant players in setting military strategy, often sidelining political considerations.
And this was profoundly dangerous because they lacked that necessary education and appreciation for political military strategy that statesmen like Otto von Bismarck actually possessed. Bismarck's wise, sometimes arbitrary, but usually strategically sound diplomacy and timing enabled those unification victories. But the military internally credited those wins entirely to their own superior operational prowess.
They completely confused operational mastery with strategic wisdom. They forgot, or chose to ignore, Clausewitz's fundamental teaching. War is fundamentally a political instrument, serving political ends. And in a really chilling moment of prophecy, Lewis brings us back to Helmut von Moltke the Elder. The architect himself saw this structural flaw developing.
He saw it coming.
He did.
Yeah.
In one of his last public appearances, speaking to the Reichstag in 1890, he warned them about the future. He said, given the current massive force levels and the complex web of alliances across Europe, no nation could realistically expect to win a future war with a single decisive campaign anymore.
He explicitly said that.
Explicitly, he warned that the next major European war could last 7 years, maybe even 30 years. And he stated it would ultimately rend the fabric of European society. He foresaw the very limitations, the danger of prolonged attritional warfare, that the narrow, purely operational focus of his successors would tragically ensure came true just a couple of decades later.
Wow. A chilling prophecy indeed.
So, to try and synthesize this whole deep dive for you, the Preston system, starting from that universal citizen army, through Moltke's operational doctrine of external concentration, it absolutely excelled at solving the immediate practical problems of mass industrial warfare. The curriculum of the General Staff School, the Kriegsacademy, created arguably the most effective operational experts the world had ever seen, masters of rapid mobilization, decisive maneuver, overwhelming battlefield tactics.
But that cultural obsession with decisiveness, that Angriffschutz's attack mania, it became its own self-imposed strategic limitation, didn't it? By focusing so narrowly on purely military means, by dismissing philosophy and broad history, the officer corps essentially blinded itself to Clausewitz's core warnings about war being an extension of politics, needing political guidance.
That's it. They built the world's most sophisticated tactical machine. Truly remarkable. But they lacked the comprehensive wisdom, strategic perspective to steer the state effectively through the immense political complexities of a prolonged total war when it finally came.
The German experience, then, offers this stark, really timeless lesson, doesn't it? Exceptional operational competence is not, and just never can be, the same thing as sound strategic judgment. They aren't interchangeable.
Not at all.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? Here's something to think about. Consider that rigorous focus of the General Staff School on decisiveness and initiative. Remember how Harkness noted that mistakes in choosing the means were forgiven less harshly than omissions and neglects in action was the cardinal sin. How might that intense cultural emphasis on speed, on action, on the absolute rejection of hesitation, how might that have ultimately reinforced the General Staff's strategic short-sightedness? Their inability, perhaps, to accept the necessary, sometimes frustrating political constraints required for truly sound grand strategy.
Yeah, how did the very strengths they cultivated perhaps become their ultimate strategic weakness? Something for you to chew on until our next deep dive.
See you next time.